This lecture will give a brief introduction to clustering. I'm going to start by giving some context comparison between supervised learning, what we've been doing mostly so far, and unsupervised learning, and then give an overview of clustering. And I'm going to give two examples, k-means and DBSCAN, to give you two examples of different approaches to clustering. And then talk a bit broadly about also other methods and evaluating clusters. So what we've been looking at so far is mostly supervised learning when we are doing curve fitting and those attempts to predicting, regression and so on. And basically what characterizes supervised learning is that our data includes some target values that we want to have our hypothesis predict, whether we are doing descriptive models where we just want to fit the model to the data, or if we want to predict something outside our training set. Regardless of that, we are comparing the output of our hypothesis to those target values. This gives us an error measure, for example, the mean quadratic error when we did regression, and we fit the parameters of our model in order to minimize this error. So if we are dealing with continuous values, we are trying to approximate the data. This is a regression problem. When we deal with discrete classes, like we saw in the last lecture with classification, we are trying to separate our space into different regions, splitting the data into different classes. But either way, we are optimizing the parameters in our model by checking this error measure and trying to minimize it. With unsupervised learning, which we saw some examples in PCA, manifold learning, and so on, we are not really trying to approximate some target value in the data. What we're doing is we are using the learner to try to transform the features that we have in our data into new features that are more useful. So basically we're trying to find some structure in data. In the case of clustering, we're trying to find meaningful groups of examples. So there is also a relation that we can think between classification and clustering. We can think of them as fundamentally similar because we are grouping the examples into categories, into clusters or classes, whatever we may call them. But the major difference is that in a classification problem, we have class labels as part of the training data. So generally, we want to fit our model so that we can predict classes outside the training data, but we have the labels in the training data to help us adjust the model. In clustering, the clusters are like classes that the model is assigning to the data, but we don't have them in the data. So clustering is generally not used to predict things about points outside our training data. It's more used to find structure in the data, to find something, meaningful groups in the data. So the question here arises in clustering: how are we going to assign these labels, these cluster labels, to our data? So the basic idea is to try to group together things that are similar and keep apart entities that are different. So if we have these clouds of points in 2 dimensions, we can consider that we have, for example, 3 clusters here. We will group these points according to their distance in Euclidean distance in this space of 2 features, and we consider that to be the measure of how different they are, or how similar if we consider the inverse of the distance or something like that. So this is the basic idea. We need some measure of difference or similarity within the cluster, so between examples, and also the ability often to measure them between the clusters, so that we have this notion of how to put examples that are similar, closer together in the same groups, and keep apart those that are more different. And when we are using clustering, it's important to think about what the objective is. So basically, we want to understand data and how it's organized, how it's structured, but what do we really want here? Do we want to try to find meaningful groups? Do we want to try to reduce our data to some subset of relevant examples? Do we want to find similarities, things like that? So your choice of clustering algorithm and measures of similarity will depend mostly on the purpose of clustering. But remember that underlying this is always the goal of trying to understand the structure in the data. So this is a famous and old example of clustering. This is a sketch from Charles Darwin, the tree of life, and this is hierarchical clustering. So these are groups of species that are very similar, that are then grouped together in higher taxa. So as we go on higher in the taxonomy and so on. So we have groups within groups within groups, and this is a form of clustering. Of course, Darwin didn't use computers, but he was trying to represent the relations between organisms, living organisms, as hierarchical clustering. A more recent example, if you check this paper, it's identifying regions or cities in China that are not inhabited. So there's a lot of construction in China in many places where the people actually don't go live. They just buy the houses and don't live there. And this was done using density-based clustering applied to data on mobile phone location. So it was possible to find clusters where people went to work, where people went home, and where there was no density, even though there was a lot of buildings and lots of residential homes, but no density of mobile phones there. So this was used to identify those empty buildings in several cities in China. So we have this basic idea of clustering entities together, but this may be used for many different purposes: finding useful classes, identify outliers, summarize data. And I'll just give an example of summarization. We're going to look at this a bit in more detail. But the idea is that when we cluster using prototypes, we have these representatives of the whole group. Then we can then use in place of the group, and so reduce the number of examples we have in our data set, while still keeping the overall shape of the distribution of the data. For example, suppose that we have these data, these blue dots here, semi-transparent in the background, but we don't want to use all of them. We just want to reduce this to a representative sample that gives us more or less the same shape and the same distribution. So this would be an example of using clustering for summarization, where we can use more or fewer points, prototypes, but we are representing the same sort of distribution of our data, at least the same regions where the data lie, using fewer points that we can control how many points to use. But one important question when we're trying to define clusters is exactly what criteria we're going to use, how many clusters, what are the parameters, and this usually takes some effort, because we need to understand the purpose and how to encode our goals into the algorithm. So there are different clustering algorithms that take different approaches. I'm going to give two examples today, and they also have parameters that we can fine-tune, and usually this is not a trivial problem to solve. For example, even with this very simple example, we may question if we have two clusters, these points here and these points here, or maybe we have three clusters. Maybe these points form a group that is separate from these, or four clusters. These could be divided like this, or even five if we put these in different groups. So depending on on how we are looking at the data or the parameters that we use, we can cluster these groups differently. So remember, there is this big difference between clustering and classification, in that in clustering we don't have the target labels in our data. So basically we are making up the groups, and depending on the parameters that we use and the algorithms that we use, we'll get different results. So there are different considerations that we can make when trying to define our clusters. First, we can think whether we want to divide the data all at the same level, so basically doing a partition, or if we have hierarchical relations, if we have clusters within clusters. For example, this would be partitional clustering. We are dividing our points into these 5 clusters, but we could think of this as a hierarchy of clusters. So we have the red cluster here and the green cluster. These are larger clusters. But then within the green cluster, we have 2 subclusters, these triangles here and these triangles pointing up. And within the red cluster, we have 3 subclusters given by the different shapes. So we can think of hierarchical clustering as this nesting of clusters within clusters. And this may, in some cases, be a better representation of our data. So one thing to think about is whether we want to partition everything at the same level or have clusters within clusters. Then we also need to think about membership. Do we want each example to belong only to one cluster, to more than one cluster, or to have some non-binary membership indicators? For example, in fuzzy clustering, we use values, continuous values between 0 and 1 to determine how much one point belongs to one cluster. This is useful to capture concepts that are not very well defined. For example, hot or salty or things like that. If you are doing questionnaires and asking people opinions about these kinds of distinctions, there is not a clear, for example, temperature when the water goes from warm, stops being warm, and now is hot. Probably there is a range there that will be between warm and hot, or a mixture of both. And then with probabilistic clustering, we also use these continuous values, but they actually represent probability. So I have these properties of adding up to 1 over all the clusters and so on. Another thing that we need to decide is the coverage of our clusters. Are we going to require that all examples be assigned to a cluster, or are we going to cluster only some examples and leave some unassigned, for example, because they are noise or irrelevant or something like that? So basically, we need to think about these things when choosing the algorithm. We also have different approaches. For example, we can do clustering based on prototypes, where we have some description of something that represents a point in our data, whether it is a chosen point in our data or whether it is some synthetic vector of features that the clustering algorithm creates. But this prototype represents the cluster, and points belong to a cluster by choosing their representative, their prototype. For example, in this case, it would be by distance. We have these prototypes here, and the points belong to different clusters depending on the closest prototype. So any point that is on this region will fall in this cluster because it's closer to this prototype. In this region, it's this cluster, and so on. But there can be other ways of figuring out which is the prototype for each point. We can also define clusters by contiguity, by looking at points that are closer together in some contiguous manner. For example, this would be one cluster here in blue, this another in green, or based on density. In this case, we can even discard points that are in low density regions. So this would be an example of density-based clustering, where we create one cluster here because we have a dense cloud of points, another here, and all the rest of these points in black are discarded as noise. So they don't belong to any cluster, they are unlabeled. So basically, what you need to do when you are applying clustering is to think about what helps you understand the structure in the data for the particular problem that you're trying to solve, and then think about how you're going to organize that data, the kind of clustering you're going to do, and how you're going to compare them, what is the measure of similarity that you're going to use, what kind of clustering are you going to do, whether the way you assign the points, if you have clusters within clusters, and so on. So remember that this is not usually a clear-cut problem as trying to predict some label outside the training set, as we often did with previous examples. This is a more a harder to define problem of trying to find a way to understand the data better and finding the structure in the data. So you really need to think about and decide these different issues when using clustering. So let's start with an example of a prototype-based clustering, k-means. This is a simple clustering method, and the idea is that we predefine how many clusters we want. The clusters are defined by the proximity to a mean point of all the points that belong to the clusters. These are the centroids, and we defined previously the number of centroids. This corresponds to the number of clusters. And this is a partitional clustering. Everything will be on the same level. It's exclusive. Each point only belongs to one cluster. It clusters all the points and has these centroids as representatives. I'm going to explain the Lloyd's algorithm for producing these clusters, which basically starts with a random set of centroids, then assigns each example to the closest centroid, and updates the centroids to the mean point of their respective clusters. Then we do this until it converges. We don't have any change in the clusters. So let's suppose we have these sets of points. For the initialization, we start with coordinates of a random set of examples. There are other methods of initialization, but we can. I'm going to use this one for illustration. So basically, this would be our initial centroids for the clusters. Now we can compute the membership of each point to the clusters by looking at which centroid is closer to each point. For example, this point here is closest to this centroid, which represents this cluster with the red circle. These are closer to the blue square, and so on. And now that we have these clusters defined, we can move the centroids to the center. There are different ways of initializing. For example, one random partition would be to assign randomly each point to one cluster and then compute the centroids as the centers of the clusters. But the idea is that we start with a randomized clustering. And then what we do is each time we have these clusters defined, we can recompute the centroid of the cluster by computing the mean point of the points belonging to the cluster. So we take all these triangles, for example, and now we compute the mean, and this will be the new position of the centroid. The same thing will happen here for the square, for the circle, and so on. So now we have, in the second iteration, the centroids have moved, so now we recompute the clusters. Points will now change assignment to different clusters because the prototypes, the centroids that represent the clusters, are in different positions. And now we keep doing this, updating the centroids, updating the clusters, and do this iteratively until we reach convergence. That is, we reach a point where we have no change in the clusters. So now the algorithm finishes because there is no more change, and we have our final clusters. So usually we use Euclidean distance, but you can use any distance measure. This is the general Minkowski distance, where you take the absolute value of the difference between the coordinates of the points. you raise that to p, you sum everything, and then you take the p root of that. So with p equals 2, we have Euclidean distance, but you can use other distances. And in general, you will need to standardize the features, because if the features have different units, this will be distorted also, although that may depend on the problem in particular. There is also a variant, because k-means has this limitation that you need to be able to compute a mean point for the cluster. Sometimes you have problems where you can compute distances, but you cannot compute a mean point. For example, suppose that these examples were text documents. You can have measures of dissimilarity or similarity between text documents, but you cannot compute the average text document by averaging the text in different documents. So if you have that kind of problem, you can use this k-medoids algorithm, which is a variant of k-means, but instead of computing the mean point of the cluster, it finds the example in the cluster that is closer to the center. So basically, it's going to find the one that has the smallest total distance to all the members of the cluster. So you have variants of k-means for those particular examples, but the idea is that you're going to find these prototypes that represent clusters, and the membership will depend on a distance measure to the prototypes. So this the way you define the distance measure and the calibration of the features, for example, by standardizing all the features and so on, so rescaling your feature vectors, is very important for this kind of algorithm. Let's see an example of application of k-means for vector quantization. Vector quantization is also the original application of this algorithm, of Lloyd's algorithm. It's a common technique in signal compression in that you are reducing a continuous space into a limited number of categories. But this is also useful when you are dealing with continuous data and you want to bring it into groups. So you want to classify them in different degrees, or organize that data for a questionnaire where you have different levels or something like that. I'm going to do this on the color values of an image, because it's easy to see the result, but this can be generalized for any kind of data. So I'm going to use this image that has only red and green. So images in color are represented by matrices of 3 channels, red, green, and blue. In this case, the image has no blue, so it's only a mixture of red and green, and this makes it easy to plot the pixel values. So these are, if we take all these pixel values and we plot them with the intensity of the red channel on the horizontal axis and the intensity of the green channel on the vertical axis, this is the distribution of colors in this image. So now we can take this. This is easy if you use scikit-image. You have this emRead function that allows you to read an image into a NumPy array. So this is a three-dimensional NumPy array that has the width of the image, the height of the image, and the depth is 3 because you have red, green, and blue. But we're going to throw away the blue. We're going to keep only the first 2 columns, and only to keep the intensities of red and green. And we're also going to rescale everything to between 0 and 1, because these are represented as bytes, so integers between 0 and 255, and we're going to convert that into between 0 and 1. Okay, so plotting is easy. We just plot these columns. The only different thing here is that we are getting a list of all these colors of the. So these are the all the pixels in the matrix, but in a matrix, all the pixels in the image, but in a matrix that has as many rows as the total number of pixels. So width multiplied by height, and as many columns as the depth here, which is 3, so red, green, and blue. the only thing is blue is always at 0, but we can use a list of these as the colors for our plot if we use the scatter plot. So this allows us to give different colors to different points, and we can visualize the image like this. Okay, so now we can use k-means, for example, with 64 centroids, and try to find representative colors that are distributed here according to the density of these clouds of the actual pixel colors that we have. So we use k-means here. This is just, you have this object in this class in scikit-learn, so you can import here from the clustering module. We specify how many clusters we want. So in this case, we want 64 colors. So we specify 64 clusters, and we fit using the matrix that we created here for the image. So this is just the two columns, red and green. And now we can just represent the centroids here. So basically, all you need to do to fit the clustering is this line of code. We create the k-means, we fit. The fit method also returns the object, so you can do this in a single line, and you retain the fit object for the k-means. And now we can get the labels by using predict on the same set of points. So we get the corresponding labels for these points. K-means gives us the labels by looking at the closest centroid. We also have this attribute here that gives us the centroid coordinates. So now we can plot this. I have two scatters because for visibility I'm drawing a black cross and then a white cross inside. So that's why I have two scatter plots here, one in black, one in white, with a smaller marker size. But these are the positions of the centroids. And now we can convert each color to its centroid. So we're going to iterate through the colors, and for each color in our image, we're going to convert the two first columns, so the red and green channels, into the centroid coordinates for that we obtain for that particular point. So this converts the colors into, instead of having all these red, green, and blue with each channel specified by 8 bits, so a total of 24 bits per color, we are restricting this to only 64 colors. And in this case, you can see that we don't really lose much quality in the image, because with 64 colors, visually the image is practically the same. So we managed to simplify the representation in this way by choosing 64 representatives of this very large space of possible colors using 24 bits. We can compress more. So, for example, if we use k-means with 8 clusters, this will be the colors that will be created, just these 8 different colors, and all the pixels will be changed to the corresponding color. So here, if you look at the image with a bit more attention, you can probably see slight differences, but it's still close enough to the original. So that was k-means. With k-means we have to specify the number of clusters, and it's based on those prototypes. I'm going to show you a different approach to clustering, which is DBSCAN, density-based clustering. And this algorithm has two parameters. We have a distance, epsilon, that specifies the neighborhood for each point. So all points within distance epsilon of a point are the neighborhood of that point. And then we have this minimum points parameter that distinguishes between core points and non-core points. A core point is one that has at least this number of neighbors. So the algorithm now is to visit each point in our sample and determine if this point has at least this number of neighbors. That is, if the number of points within epsilon of p is smaller than the minimum number of points, then we presume that P is nice. It's in a region with not enough density. Otherwise, we're going to create a cluster for this point P, because if it has at least this number of points in the neighborhood, it is a core point, and so it belongs to a cluster. But now we're going to test all the points in the neighborhood of P and add them also to this cluster of P. So everything in the neighborhood of a core point is also part of the same cluster. And if there is another core point in the neighborhood, we're going to merge the two clusters into a single cluster. So when we do this over all the points, we get something like this. If we have these data, these points here are noise with the parameters that I used, because they don't have enough neighbors within their neighborhood. These points belong all to the same cluster, blue, because they have a large set of core points here that are neighbors of one another. And these points belong to the green cluster. So you see that if we were to do this with k-means, we would not be able to make this distinction between these clusters, because we would be using prototypes, and all the points that belong to the same that were closer to one prototype would belong to that cluster, so we couldn't capture these shapes. But with density-based clustering, we can capture these shapes, because and also handle noise, because these are not prototypes. These core points are just points that have a high density neighborhood, and they all belong to the same cluster because they are neighbors of one another. So we propagate that membership over all these high density regions, and so DBSCAN can adapt to different shapes of the clusters, as long as the clusters are based on density. It also has this property that it leaves out points that are in less dense regions. To use DBSCAN with scikit-learn is very easy. You also have a DBSCAN class here. Basically, you need to specify the epsilon, the distance that defines the neighborhood, and the minimum number of points that you have for a point to become a core point. So it needs at least these neighbors to be a core point. Now, one problem with clustering is how we can validate how good the clusters are. When we are using supervised learning, we have the labels in our data, and we can just measure the error. With the clustering, we need to think about why we want the clusters. So if the clustering is good or not depends on the purpose of clustering. If we want to determine whether or not the data has actually structure, we need to have some measure of how significant the clusters are. If we want to determine the number of clusters, we need to have some way of measuring the quality of the clusters as we change the parameters, so that we have different numbers of clusters. If we want to see if the computed clusters fit the data well, it depends on whether or not we have some external information about which examples should belong to the same cluster, and so forth. So there are different problems here. I'm just going to give a very brief overview of this, but one unsupervised way of validating clusters is trying to measure their quality, thinking about the idea that we want to put similar things together and different things apart. So we can look at the separation between different clusters, we can look at the cohesion within the clusters, and we have some measures for that. For example, the cohesion can be given by the similarity between all the pairs of points that belong to a cluster. The separation can be given by some similarity measure of all the pairs of points belonging to different clusters, and this can give the separation between two clusters. So we can use similarity here, we can use distance. Just remember that distance is a very specific measure of difference, and whether you use similarity or difference, these measures will be will have inverted scales. So similarity is higher when the points are closer together, difference is higher when the points are further apart. But the exact measure you can use here, for example, Euclidean distance or something like that, will depend on the particular problem, but this is just a general idea. We can try to see if the clusters are well separated and how cohesive they are. If we are using prototype-based clusters, we can simplify this, because cohesion can be just the sum of the similarities to the prototype, and the separation can be measured between the prototypes. But in general, we can think of it this way: looking at the pairs of points inside the cluster to see how tight the cluster is, and looking at pairs of points between two clusters to see how well the clusters are separated. One way of doing this can be, for example, with distances, by looking at the sum of squared errors. This can be the squared distance, for example, between the points. Or we can balance the two things: the distances within the clusters and distances between the clusters. So silhouette score does that, and is a common used measure. This A is the average distance of one point to all points in the same cluster. So the A of I is the average distance between one point and all points in its cluster. B is the average distance between point I and points in the nearest cluster, so the one with the lowest average distance. And now we can compute the difference between these two, so the distance to the nearest cluster minus the distance to the points within the same cluster, and divide by the largest of the two. So basically this gives us a value, a silhouette score for each point that is between -1 and 1, and we can now average this for all the points and get an average silhouette score. So if we have a negative silhouette score, it means that the distance to points within the cluster is higher than the distance to points on the other cluster, and this means that our clusters are not separated. If we have a value that is close to 1, it means that the distance within the same cluster is much lower than the distance to other clusters. So this would be indicate that clusters are very well separated. And you can use this easily with the silhouette score function in scikit-learn. So these are some examples. If we have these points in 3 different clusters, this will give a silhouette score of 0.73. So this is close to 1 because the clusters are clearly separated and are cohesive. The points are close together within the clusters. If we cluster them in 2 clusters, we get a lower silhouette score because now these red points are all in the same cluster. We have this frontier here between green and red. So this could be a good way, when we have this type of data, of optimizing the number of clusters by looking at the silhouette score. Of course, this does not work well for all shapes of clusters. For example, if we have these kinds of clusters, we have a very low silhouette score with 3 prototypes and 3 clusters. This intuitively seems to be 3 clusters, but with k-means we don't capture the clusters very well, and we have a low silhouette score here that in this case may be indicative that we are not capturing the clusters well. There's also the problem of, for example, in k-means, when we have clusters of different sizes, k-means cannot handle that very well because it separates, it assigns the points to the closest centroid. So here this frontier may not be ideal. This also affects the silhouette score. But note that a low silhouette score doesn't mean the clustering is bad if we don't have compact clusters. For example, this would be a good way of clustering these data, but this would give a low silhouette score because of the way the clusters are close together, and the points within the cluster can be very far apart. So this gives us a low silhouette score even though this clustering is good. So silhouette score is a useful measure when we have compact clusters. It's not very good if our clusters have different shapes. And then we can also use external indexes or relative indexes. For example, if we have data that has labels, or some of our data has labels, we can compare the clusters we have with the pairs of labels. So to see if things that have the same label fall in the same cluster, or if they have different labels fall in different clusters. We can also compare different clusterings to see how different they are. Basically looking at that pairs of points to see if they fall in the same cluster or different clusters in the different ways we have of clustering them. But the fundamental problem here is that validating clustering is not a clear-cut problem, because we cannot really define one simple measure to tell us how good or bad the clusters are, since clustering is going to be used for many different things, and basically to try to understand the data. So this is not a simple, validating clustering is not simple. It's easier if you have a clear idea of why you want to cluster your data. So maybe my advice would be to always start from that point. Really think about what you need clustering for, and that would give you an idea of how to try to validate your clusters. Okay, so to sum up, this is a broad field. Again, like classification, we are covering this only in 45 minutes, so this is a very condensed and brief introduction. But the idea is that we want to group data by some measure of similarity, and the purpose will be to try to help us understand something about the data. So now we have many choices here, hierarchical or partitional clustering, if we want to cluster all the points or only relevant points, if we want to do it with prototypes, with density, with contiguity, with probabilities. There are many different types of clustering algorithms, but we need to think about the purpose of our clustering and the kind of data that we are dealing with to decide on this. We saw two examples. We don't have time to look at many different examples. So we have prototype-based clustering is k-means. I have here affinity propagation, but we did not. I didn't have time to include that here, but you can look up in scikit-learn affinity propagation. You have the algorithms there. By the way, if you're interested in clustering, you can look at scikit-learn. They have tutorials on different clustering methods and visualization of the results, so you can have an idea of the kind of clustering algorithms that you can use easily. We also saw DBSCAN for density-based clustering. Clustering validation is a very difficult problem, and it's mostly a function of the goal of clustering. Why you want to do clustering determines how you're going to validate your clusters. Okay, so that's all for this part of data science. This will be mostly the code for this part of clustering is trivial, because in all these examples we are using the scikit-learn library, and so it's 1 or 2 lines of code to write these examples. But the main part here will be more the theoretical concepts behind clustering that we only covered very superficially, but they are important if you try to use clustering for solving some problem.